People like you don't speak to my father." The sentence didn't just land, it froze the entire room mid-breath, like someone had pressed pause on a $2,000 later plate dinner. Crystal glasses hovered inches from lips. A fork stopped halfway to a perfectly cut fillet. Even the soft jazz in the background seemed to shrink, like it knew it wasn't the most important sound anymore. Alexander Reed stood there, tall, composed, every inch the billionaire CEO the city whispered about in boardrooms and back channels. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Power like his never shouted. It simply existed and expected the world to adjust. In front of him stood Naomi Carter, a waitress in a crisp black uniform, a small notepad tucked neatly into her apron, her posture straight but unassuming. To most in the room, she was invisible. A moving part of the machine. A pair of hands delivering wine, clearing plates, refilling water no one remembered asking for. But in that moment, every eye found her. Not because of who she was, but because of what she had just tried to do. Across the table sat William Reed. The father. The legend behind the empire. A man older than the room's ambition, quieter than its wealth, and somehow heavier than both. He hadn't spoken since he arrived. Not to the investors. Not to the executives. Not even to his own son. He simply sat there, hands resting near a glass of untouched red wine, eyes distant, like he was somewhere far beyond the polished marble floors and gold-lit chandeliers. People didn't approach him. They didn't dare. The staff had been warned before the night even began. Serve him. Don't engage. That was the rule. And in places like this, rules weren't suggestions. They were survival. Naomi had heard it. Everyone had. And yet, minutes earlier, she had stepped closer than anyone else had all night. Not by accident. Not out of confusion. But with intention. That was when Alexander intervened. His hand didn't touch her. It didn't need to. His presence alone drew a line no one else had crossed. People like you, the phrase lingered longer than it should have. Not shouted. Not emphasized. But understood. Around them, the room adjusted itself. Eyes dropped. Shoulders shifted. Conversations pretended to resume but never quite recovered. No one wanted to be part of this moment, but no one could look away either. Naomi didn't respond. She didn't apologize. She didn't retreat. Her hands remained steady at her sides, her breathing even, her expression calm in a way that didn't match the tension tightening the air around her. Because while everyone else saw a boundary, she saw something else entirely. She saw William Reed's fingers, barely moving, just once, against the stem of his glass. Not impatience. Not irritation. Something quieter. Something lonelier. And in a room built on power, where every word was calculated and every silence was strategic, Naomi realized something no one else had. This wasn't a man people feared. This was a man no one had spoken to in a very long time. The silence did not break. It stretched. It thickened. It settled over the room like something expensive and heavy that no one knew how to move. Alexander Reed's gaze remained fixed on Naomi, not angry, not loud, but precise, like a man used to controlling outcomes before they even began. He expected compliance. That was how the world worked around him. A look, a word, and people adjusted. Deals closed. Rooms shifted. People like her stepped back. But Naomi did not move. Not forward. Not back. Just still. And in that stillness, something subtle began to change. Not in Alexander. Not yet. But in the space between Naomi and William Reed. Because while the room was watching the power, Naomi was watching the man. William's eyes had not lifted once during the exchange. Not when his son spoke. Not when the tension rose. Not even when the entire table seemed to hold its breath. He remained exactly as he had been since he arrived. Distant. Untouched. unreachable. But his fingers, they moved again. A slight tap against the glass. Once. Then still. It was not impatience. It was rhythm. Almost like memory trying to surface. Naomi noticed. No one else did. Around the room, conversations tried to restart, but they sounded forced, thin, like background noise pretending to be normal. A woman at the far end let out a quiet laugh that ended too quickly. A man adjusted his cufflinks twice without realizing it. Even the staff moved differently now, their steps lighter, their presence smaller, as if the air itself had become fragile. The manager stood near the service station, eyes locked on Naomi, giving a subtle shake of his head. Do not push this further. Do not risk everything for a moment that does not belong to you. But Naomi had already stepped into it. And stepping out now would not change what she had seen. She had worked rooms like this before. Nights filled with money and silence. People who spoke loudly about everything except what mattered. She had learned to read the gaps. The pauses. The things people avoided. And William Reed was not being avoided because he was powerful. He was being avoided because no one knew how to reach him. Alexander exhaled slowly, a controlled breath, the kind that signaled the end of a situation. Return to your section, he said, his voice quieter now, but firmer, as if giving her a final exit. A clean way out. No scene. No consequence. Just step away and let the night continue as planned. Naomi could have taken it. Most would have. It was safe. It was expected. It was invisible. But something in her stayed anchored. Not defiance. Not pride. Something else. Something quieter. She shifted her focus fully to William now, not challenging Alexander, not acknowledging him at all. And for the first time, she leaned just slightly closer to the table, close enough that her voice would not carry beyond where it needed to go. Close enough that it would not become a spectacle. The room did not notice the movement. Not yet. But the energy did. Because this was the moment before something changed. William's hand paused on the glass. Completely still now. Not tapping. Not moving. Waiting. And Naomi understood. Not with certainty. Not with proof. But with instinct sharpened by years of being unseen. Some silences are walls. Others are doors. And this one had just cracked open. Naomi did not rush it. She did not fill the silence with nervous words or rehearsed politeness. She let it breathe, just for a second longer, just enough for the moment to become something real. Instead of something reactive. Then, softly, with a voice meant for one person and one person only, she spoke. Permesso. The word slipped into the air like it belonged there, like it had been waiting all night to be said. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just precise. Italian. Simple. Respectful. The kind of word that does not demand attention, but earns it. And something happened. Not in the room. Not in the crowd. In him. William Reed's fingers tightened slightly around the stem of the glass, not enough to draw notice, but enough to confirm what Naomi had sensed all along. His head did not snap up. He did not react the way people expect powerful men to react. Instead, slowly, almost reluctantly, his eyes shifted. Not to Alexander. Not to the table. To her. The first time all night he had truly looked at anyone. And when he did, the room changed, even if no one could yet explain why. Naomi did not smile. She did not bow her head. She simply held the moment steady, her posture calm, her gaze respectful but unafraid. Because this was not about challenging him. It was about reaching him. Around them, the world continued in fragments. A glass set down too carefully. A chair adjusted with unnecessary precision. Someone whispered a question that no one answered. But at the center of it all, something invisible had shifted direction. William's eyes narrowed just slightly, not in suspicion, but in recognition. Like hearing a song you have not heard in years and realizing you still remember every note. His lips parted, just enough to suggest a response, then stopped. The hesitation was not weakness. It was weight. Memory does not return gently. It arrives all at once, carrying everything with it. Naomi saw it. Not the details. Not the story. But the impact. And she stayed exactly where she was, giving him space without stepping away. Alexander noticed it too. The shift. The break-in pattern. His expression did not change, but his focus did. For the first time since the night began, he was not controlling the room. He was observing it. Watching something unfold that he had not planned, had not approved, and could not interrupt without risking something far more valuable than authority. Because this was no longer about a waitress stepping out of line. This was about his father responding to someone he had ignored for years. Naomi spoke again, just as softly, just as carefully. Con rispetto. With respect. The words were not a performance. They were an offering. And this time, William did not hesitate. His voice, when it came, was low, steady, and unmistakably present. Finalment. Finally. The single word did not echo, did not demand attention, but it landed heavier than anything that had been said all night. Naomi did not move. She did not react beyond the smallest breath. Because she understood what the room did not. This was not a conversation beginning. This was a silence ending. The word did not travel far, but it traveled deep. Finally. It lingered in the air between them, quiet and steady, like something that had been waiting years to be spoken aloud. Naomi felt it before she fully understood it, the weight behind it, the release inside it. Around them, the room had not caught up yet. Conversation still pretended to exist. Glasses still moved. But the rhythm was broken. Subtle, but undeniable. Because something had shifted at the center, and everything else was now slightly out of sync. William Reed did not look away. Not this time. His gaze stayed on Naomi, not sharp, not guarded, but searching, as if trying to place her in a memory that did not quite belong to the present. His posture changed almost imperceptibly. The distance that had surrounded him all night, that invisible wall no one could cross, did not disappear, but it softened. Enough to let something through. Naomi did not step closer. She did not take advantage of the moment. She simply remained where she was, grounded, steady, allowing the silence to hold its new meaning. Because she understood now. This was not about speaking more. This was about having said the right thing. William's hand slowly released the tension around the glass. He did not drink. He had not touched it all night. Instead, his fingers rested lightly against the table, no longer tapping, no longer searching for something to hold onto. His voice came again, still in Italian, softer this time, but clearer. Da quanto tempo, he paused, not because he forgot the words, but because the words carried something he had not allowed himself to feel in a very long time. Naomi listened, not interrupting, not translating, not performing for the room that was now quietly leaning in without realizing it. Nessuno parla così. No one speaks like that anymore. The sentence settled gently, but its meaning stretched far beyond the table. It was not about language. It was about how people spoke. Why they spoke. What they meant when they did. Alexander Reed heard it. Even if he did not understand every word, he understood enough. Enough to know that something had happened that he could not replicate, could not buy, could not command. His father was speaking. Not to him. Not to the investors. But to her. And that shifted something deeper than authority. It shifted control. Alexander's jaw tightened just slightly, not in anger, but in realization. For years, he had built systems, networks, influence that could move markets, shape industries, command respect. But none of that had reached this man sitting inches away from him. None of it had broken the silence. And yet one word had. One moment. One person he had almost dismissed without a second thought. Naomi noticed the shift in Alexander, but she did not acknowledge it. This was not his moment. This was not about proving anything. It was about honoring what had just opened. William leaned back slightly in his chair, the first true movement of comfort he had shown all evening. His eyes remained on Naomi, but there was something different in them now. Not distance. Not isolation. Recognition. Not of who she was in the world, but of what she had done in this moment. He studied her, not with suspicion, but with curiosity that felt almost unfamiliar to him. Like remembering how to ask a question after years of not needing to. Naomi met his gaze without hesitation, her expression calm, her presence unwavering. Because she was not trying to impress him. She was not trying to earn anything. She had already given what mattered. And that was why it worked. The room began to feel it now. Not the details. Not the language. But the shift. The tension that had once filled the air was no longer sharp. It was something else now. Something quieter. Something human. A man at the far end lowered his voice without realizing it. A woman stopped checking her phone. Even the staff moved differently, less hurried, more aware. Because when something real happens in a room built on appearances, it does not need to announce itself. It changes the air. And everyone breathes it, whether they understand it or not. The room did not return to what it was before. It could not. Something invisible had been rewritten, and even the smallest movements now carried a different weight. William Reed exhaled slowly, not like a man releasing tension, but like someone rediscovering the rhythm of breathing after holding it for far too long. His gaze remained on Naomi, steady and present, no longer drifting somewhere beyond the room. For the first time that evening, he was not elsewhere. He was here. And everyone could feel it, even if they could not explain it. Naomi stood without shifting her stance, her hands relaxed, her posture unchanged, as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. Because to her, this was not extraordinary. It was human. It was what happens when someone chooses to see instead of assume, to listen instead of avoid. William's voice came again, this time slower, the words forming with intention rather than memory. Come high imperato, he paused, his eyes studying her more carefully now, not just recognizing the language, but the way she carried it. Kosi? How did you learn like that? The question was simple, but it was the first real question he had asked all night. Not a statement. Not a reaction. A question. And in a room where people usually answered to him, he was now asking her. Naomi allowed herself a small breath before responding, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for the moment itself. My grandmother, she said softly, still keeping her voice contained within the space between them. She was from Florence. She did not elaborate. She did not turn it into a story. She let the truth sit as it was. Clear. Unpolished. Enough. William's expression shifted again, this time. Unmistakably. Not dramatic. Not visible to everyone. But real. The kind of shift that happens behind the eyes, where memory connects to something personal, something protected. Florence. The word did not need translation. It carried its own gravity. His hand moved slightly across the table, not reaching for anything, just grounding himself in the present. Firenze, he repeated, almost to himself, the pronunciation soft, careful, like touching something fragile. Around them, the room leaned closer without moving. No one interrupted. No one dared to break what was unfolding, even if they did not fully understand it. Because now it was clear. This was no longer a disruption. This was a moment. Alexander watched it all, his usual composure intact, but his understanding shifting with every second. He had spent years building access, influence, proximity to power. But this was different. This was not access granted. This was access earned without asking. And it unsettled him in a way he could not show. Because there was no strategy for this. No negotiation. No leverage. Just presence. Naomi noticed none of that, or perhaps she chose not to. Her focus never left William, because she understood something the room was only beginning to realize. This conversation was not about language. It was about permission. And he had just given it. William leaned forward slightly now, a movement so small it would have gone unnoticed earlier in the night, but now it felt significant. Intentional. Alive. Multi-Annie, he said, his voice quieter, but steadier. Many years. The words carried something deeper than time. They carried absence. Loss. Distance measured not in miles, but in silence. Naomi did not interrupt. She did not fill the space with sympathy or curiosity. She simply stayed, allowing him to continue if he chose to. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can offer someone is not a response, but room. William looked down briefly at the table, his fingers brushing lightly against the edge, then back up at her. And for the first time, there was something unmistakable in his expression. Not authority. Not distance. Gratitude. Subtle, but undeniable. He nodded. Once. Not to dismiss her. Not to end the interaction. But to acknowledge it. To acknowledge her. And in a room where acknowledgement from a man like him meant everything, it meant something entirely different now. Because it was not given out of status. It was given out of connection. And that was something no one in that room had been able to reach. Until she did. The nod did not end the moment. It deepened it. Because once acknowledgement is given, something else follows. Presence. William Reed did not retreat back into silence the way he had before. He remained there, engaged, aware, as if something inside him had been turned back on after years of quiet dormancy. His eyes did not drift. They stayed with Naomi, steady, grounded, as though letting go now would mean losing whatever had just been found. Around them, the room had fully surrendered to the shift. Conversations no longer pretended to continue. They had stopped entirely, replaced by a collective stillness that felt less like tension and more like attention. People were not just watching anymore. They were listening, even if they could not understand every word. Because understanding was no longer the point. Feeling was. William adjusted slightly in his chair, his posture no longer rigid, no longer guarded. There was a subtle ease to him now, like someone who had set down a weight they did not realize they were carrying. His voice came again, this time in English, slower, measured, as if each word had to pass through something deeper before being spoken. My wife, she was from there. The sentence was simple. But it carried everything. Naomi did not interrupt. She did not offer sympathy. She did not soften her expression in a way that would make it about comfort. She simply received it. Because this was not something that needed to be fixed. It needed to be heard. William's gaze lowered for a brief moment, not out of avoidance, but reflection. She used to say, he continued, his voice quieter now, almost private despite the room around them, that respect is not in how loudly you speak, but in how carefully you choose your words. The memory did not break him. It steadied him. And that was what made it powerful. Naomi felt the meaning settle, not just in the words, but in the way he carried them. She sounds wise, Naomi replied softly, her tone even, her presence unchanged. She did not try to impress him. She did not try to match his story. She met it with truth. And that was enough. William gave a faint smile. Not wide. Not performative. Just real. The kind of expression that does not ask to be seen, but is felt when it appears. Across the table, Alexander shifted his weight slightly, the smallest movement betraying a realization he could not ignore anymore. This was no longer a moment he could control. It was not a disruption he could correct. It was something far more difficult to manage. Something genuine. And in rooms like this, where everything is designed, curated, controlled, genuine moments do not follow rules. They rewrite them. Alexander's eyes moved from his father to Naomi, studying her now with a different lens. Not as staff. Not as a variable. But as someone who had access to space he had not been able to reach. And that recognition carried its own weight. Not resentment. Not yet. But awareness. Naomi did not acknowledge him. Not out of defiance, but because she understood something essential. This moment did not belong to power. It belonged to connection. And connection does not need permission from authority. William leaned back slightly, his shoulders no longer tense, his presence no longer distant. He looked around the room for the first time, not scanning, not assessing, but noticing. Really noticing. And what he saw was different now. The same people. The same setting. But a different atmosphere. Quieter. More honest. As if something had been stripped away. His gaze returned to Naomi, and this time, there was no distance left in it. Only clarity. "Thank you," he said simply. 2 words. No embellishment. No weight added. But in a room where words were often used to impress, to persuade, to dominate, these words stood apart. Because they were not used for power. They were used for truth. Naomi gave a small nod in return, not lowering herself, not elevating herself, just meeting him where he was. Equal in that moment, even if the world around them would never describe it that way. And that was the quiet shift no one could undo. The man who owned everything in that room had finally been seen. And the person who was never meant to be noticed had become the only one who truly saw him. The words settled without echo, but their impact did not fade. "Thank you." In a room where gratitude was often strategic, rehearsed, or transactional, this felt different. It did not ask for anything in return. It did not attempt to shift power. It simply existed, clean and complete. Naomi accepted it the same way she had accepted everything else that night. Without dramatics. Without lowering herself. Without stepping into a role the room might expect her to play. She gave a small nod, nothing more, and for a brief second, the moment stood perfectly balanced between them. Then reality began to move again. A chair shifted somewhere behind them. A glass was finally lifted and set down with a soft, careful sound. The world, which had paused, began to remember itself. But it did not return unchanged. Because once something real happens in a room like this, it leaves a trace that cannot be erased. William Reed glanced down at the table once more, then back up, his expression thoughtful, no longer distant. He was present now in a way that altered everything around him. "Sit," he said quietly, not as a command, but as an invitation. The word carried weight, not because of authority, but because of who it came from. And it sent a ripple through the room that was impossible to ignore. Naomi did not move immediately. Not out of hesitation, but out of awareness. She understood what that invitation meant in a place like this. Lines were not meant to be crossed. Roles were not meant to shift. And yet, they already had. Alexander reacted before anyone else could. "She is working," he said, his tone controlled, but tighter now, the first sign that something inside him had shifted from observation to intervention. It was not anger. It was correction. An attempt to restore structure. To re-establish what was supposed to be. But William did not look at him. Not right away. His eyes remained on Naomi, steady, patient, as if the decision had already been made and did not require approval. For a moment, William added, his voice calm, unshaken. Not louder. Just final. The difference was subtle, but unmistakable. This was not a discussion. It was a choice. The room felt it immediately. Power had shifted again, but this time it was not loud. It was quiet. Certain. Alexander held his position for a fraction of a second longer, then stepped back. Not physically. But internally, he recognized it. This was not a moment he could override without breaking something he could not afford to break. Not his authority. Something deeper. His connection to the man across from him. Naomi understood all of it without needing it explained. She moved carefully, deliberately, pulling the empty chair slightly back and sitting down with a quiet composure that did not draw attention to itself. No sudden movements. No hesitation. Just presence. And when she sat, the entire room shifted with her. Because this was no longer about a waitress stepping beyond her role. This was about a human being invited into a space that had never made room for her before. William leaned back slightly, observing her now from a different angle, not across a divide, but beside it. "Tell me," he said, his tone softer now, more curious than commanding, "do you always listen this closely?" Naomi met his gaze, steady and calm. "Only when it matters," she replied. No performance. No attempt to impress. Just truth. And that answer did something subtle, but powerful. It removed the hierarchy completely from the moment. Because she was not speaking up. She was speaking across. William let out a quiet breath that almost resembled a soft laugh, not because the answer was amusing, but because it was honest. And honesty, in a room built on appearances, was rare. Around them, people watched with a kind of attention they were not used to giving. Not to power. Not to money. But to something simpler. Something they had overlooked. Alexander remained still, his eyes moving between them, not with frustration, but with a growing understanding that did not come easily. He had built his world on influence. But influence had not done this. Words had not done this. Presence had. And for the first time that night, he was not the one shaping the room. He was learning from it. The chair did not belong to her. Everyone in the room knew it. The polished wood, the perfectly aligned place setting, the silent agreement of status that surrounded that table had never been meant for someone like Naomi Carter. And yet, she sat there without hesitation, without apology, without shrinking herself to fit expectations that had already been broken. William Reed watched her closely, not with judgment, but with something closer to curiosity, as if he was studying not who she was, but how she carried herself in a space that had never invited her in. There was no performance in her posture. No nervous adjustment. No attempt to prove she deserved the seat. She simply occupied it, fully, naturally, as if presence alone was enough. And in that moment, it was. The room adjusted again. Not dramatically. Not all at once. But subtly, like a tide shifting direction without announcing it. A man who had been leaning forward leaned back instead. A woman who had been whispering fell silent. Even the waitstaff, moving along the edges of the room, slowed just slightly, their attention pulled toward something they were not supposed to focus on. Because what was happening at that table was no longer part of the evening's script. It had become something else entirely. William reached for his glass, pausing just before lifting it, his fingers resting lightly against the stem. He glanced at Naomi, then at the glass, then back at her again. "She used to choose the wine," he said, almost casually, but the weight behind the sentence lingered. "Always something from home." He lifted the glass this time, taking a small sip, not out of habit, but with intention. The first time he had touched it all night. Naomi noticed. Not the action itself, but the meaning behind it. Change does not announce itself loudly. It reveals itself in small decisions. And this was one of them. "Do you still remember what she liked?" Naomi asked, her tone calm, not probing, just open. William considered the question, his eyes softening slightly as he set the glass back. "Down. Barolo," he said after a moment. "Strong. Patient. It does not rush you." There was a faint pause before he added, "She said the best things in life do not compete for attention. They wait until you are ready to notice them." Naomi gave a small nod, absorbing the words not just as information, but as something lived. "That sounds like her," she said quietly. William's lips curved again, not quite a smile, but something close enough to feel genuine. Across from them, Alexander remained still, but no longer distant. His attention was fully engaged now, not as a leader observing a situation, but as a son witnessing something he had not seen in years. His father was not just present. He was open. And that was unfamiliar territory. It shifted something inside Alexander, something that did not come with a strategy or a solution. Just awareness. Naomi felt his gaze for the first time since she sat down, but she did not turn toward him. Not because she ignored him, but because she understood something deeper. This was not about being seen by everyone. It was about seeing the one person who had been overlooked the most, even in a room built around him. William leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms gently on the table, a posture that suggested ease, not authority. "You did not hesitate," he said, his voice thoughtful now. "Most people do." Naomi met his eyes again, steady, grounded. "Most people are told not to," she replied. There was no bitterness in her tone. Just clarity. William held her gaze for a moment longer, then gave a slow, understanding nod. Because he knew that was true. Not just in this room, but everywhere. And in that understanding, something unspoken passed between them. Not agreement. Not sympathy. Recognition. The kind that does not need explanation. Around them, the room remained quiet, but not tense. It was a different kind of silence now. One that held attention instead of fear. One that allowed something real to exist without interruption. And at the center of it all, a man who had once controlled everything in the room was no longer the one defining the moment. Instead, he was part of it. And the person who had never been meant to belong there had become the reason it mattered at all. The moment did not need to grow louder to become complete. It had already reached its peak in the quietest way possible. William Reed sat there, no longer distant, no longer unreachable, but present in a way the room had not witnessed in years. His hand rested near the glass, untouched now, not because he had forgotten it, but because it no longer mattered. The conversation had replaced everything else. Across from him, Naomi Carter remained composed, her posture steady, her presence unchanged, as if she had always belonged exactly where she was. And that was the final shift. Not the words. Not the language. The belonging. William looked at her for a long moment, not searching this time, not questioning, but understanding. The kind of understanding that does not come from explanation, but from experience. "You reminded me," he said slowly, his voice carrying something deeper than gratitude, of something I stopped allowing myself to feel. Naomi did not rush to respond. She let the words settle, just as she had done all night, giving them the space they deserved. "What was that?" she asked gently. William's gaze softened, not with sadness, but with clarity. "Connection," he said. The word was simple. But in a room built on transactions, it felt almost unfamiliar. Around them, the silence held again, but this time it was not heavy. It was open. William leaned back slightly, his shoulders relaxed, his presence fully grounded in the moment. "People speak to be heard," he continued, his tone reflective, but very few speak to understand. His eyes met Naomi's again. "You did both." Naomi gave a small, respectful nod, not absorbing the praise, not deflecting it, just accepting it as part of the moment. Because this was never about recognition. It was about truth. Across the table, Alexander Reed finally shifted, not to interrupt, but to step into something he could no longer ignore. His voice, when it came, was measured, but different now. Less controlled. More considered. "Naomi," he said, using her name for the first time, not as a title, not as a role, but as a person. She turned to him then, calmly, without hesitation. Alexander held her gaze for a moment, as if recalibrating something he had always assumed was fixed. "Thank you," he said, the words quieter than his father's, but no less real. Naomi nodded once more, acknowledging him the same way she had acknowledged William. Equal. Balanced. Unforced. And in that brief exchange, something else shifted. Not just in the room. In him. Because for the first time that night, Alexander was not speaking from power. He was speaking from awareness. William observed the interaction, a faint expression of approval passing through his features, subtle but unmistakable. Not because of the words, but because of what they represented. A change. Small, but real. He reached for his glass once more, lifting it slightly, not as a toast, not as a performance, but as a gesture that held quiet meaning. To being seen, he said softly. The words did not rise above the room, but they reached everyone in it. Because whether they admitted it or not, everyone there understood what it meant to be overlooked, even if their reasons were different. Naomi did not raise a glass. She did not need to. She simply remained present, her expression calm, her eyes steady, embodying the very thing he had just spoken. William took a small sip, then set the glass down with care, his movements no longer distant, no longer automatic. Intentional. Alive. The room slowly began to move again, but not in the same way it had before. Conversations returned, but softer. Laughter came back, but more measured. The energy had changed, and it would not return to what it had been. Because something had been revealed that could not be unseen. Naomi stood after a moment, not abruptly, not hesitantly, just naturally, as if she understood the moment had reached its close. She did not wait for permission. She did not seek approval. She simply moved. William watched her stand, his gaze following her with quiet respect. You chose your words carefully, he said, almost to himself. Naomi paused, just briefly, meeting his eyes one last time. They deserve to be, she replied. No more. No less. And with that, she stepped away from the table, returning to the role the room had assigned her, but not in the same way. Because now, she was no longer invisible. Not to him. Not to Alexander. And not to anyone who had witnessed what had just happened. The room belonged to power before she spoke. But when she did, it belonged to something else entirely. Something money could not command, could not purchase, could not replicate. Respect. And that night, it did not come from wealth. It came from one voice, one moment, and one word spoken at exactly the right time.